Good morning. I'm Patty Perlow, Lane County District Attorney, and sitting here with Chief Rick Lewis of Springfield Police Department. The purpose of this gathering is to let the public know about the findings regarding the March 31st, 2019 officer-involved shooting by Springfield Police. The involved people are Stacy William Kenny, formerly known as Patrick William Kenny. He changed his name and gender last fall through Lane County Circuit Court. I spoke with his family yesterday, and they indicated that their preference and Mr. Kenny's preference was to be referred to as a male. He suffered from schizophrenia and has been having some episodes involving his mental illness recently, and had been having those episodes last summer and during the time when he went into court to change his name and gender. On March 31st at about 8:45 p.m., Officer Craig Aiken, Craig K-R-A-I-G, Aiken A-K-I-N, observed a 2018 Nissan Leaf and made some observations about the driving being a little bit erratic. The vehicle pulled into a gas station, and Officer Aiken proceeded on without making contact. He observed the vehicle again on Olympic at about 32nd and made some observations that were traffic violations, and so attempted to stop the vehicle. Actually, he pulled in behind the vehicle. The vehicle stopped in the bike lane before Officer Aiken activated his overhead lights to conduct a traffic stop. Officer Aiken was a little bit concerned about the driving he had seen and the behavior of the operator of the vehicle, and so did not immediately make contact with the driver, stayed back from the vehicle. At that time, the window came down and an electronic alarm device was thrown by the driver, Mr. Kenny, at Officer Aiken. It landed about 6 feet in front of him, making a siren noise. Officer Aiken did not know if it was an explosive device or what it was, and so he continued to maintain observation of the vehicle and had requested some backup support. At that time, Mr. Kenny departed in his vehicle, made a U-turn on Olympic from westbound to eastbound, and started driving off. Officer Aiken activated his siren at that point in pursuit of Mr. Kenny. Mr. Kenny did not exceed 30 miles an hour during this pursuit, made a second stop, and at that point, Officer Aiken was going toward the vehicle with a firearm at low ready. Mr. Kenny called 911, and so the rest of the contact is actually recorded on an open line. Mr. Kenny drove off a second time, and Officer Aiken pursued. Mr. Kenny then was being approached from the opposite direction from Sergeant Rick Lewis, referred to as RA by the Springfield Police Department so as not to be confused with the chief, was approaching from the opposite direction with his lights and siren. He'd been at the gas pumps at 42nd and Marcola Road, and so he was the first officer to come in to help excuse me, Officer Aiken. At that point, Mr. Kenny stopped his vehicle for the third time. Sergeant Lewis parked his patrol vehicle between 3 and 5 feet in front of Mr. Kenny's vehicle, and Officer Aiken parked behind. Officer Aiken, Sergeant Lewis were at opposite sides of the vehicle. Officer Aiken was at the driver's side, Sergeant Lewis was at the passenger side, and at that point, Officer Conrad came upon the scene. Mr. Kenny had opened the window and was asking why he was being stopped, and then deployed an air horn and rolled the window back up. The officers were unable to get into the vehicle. Mr. Kinney was not complying with directions, and so the windows were broken on both the driver and passenger side in an effort to get Mr. Kinney out of the vehicle. Mr. Kinney then fought with Officer Aiken, was attempting to strike him in the face and chest. Mr. Kinney was a large person, 6'2", 235 pounds. And so the officers' efforts to get him out of the vehicle were not successful. During the struggle, Mr. Kinney's shirt came off, and Officer Conrad announced that he was going to be deploying his taser. Taser was ineffective. I believe one of the probes went into Mr. Kinney and the other probe went into his sweatshirt. And then Officer Aiken deployed his taser. The probes were too close together to be effective, and so Mr. Kinney did not cease his struggle with the officers. During that time, Sergeant Lewis managed to get the vehicle door on the passenger side open and crawled into the vehicle. The vehicle was filled with personal items. It had a couple of file cabinets, rolls and rolls of toilet paper, some food wrappers, and food ready to be consumed. And so when Sergeant Lewis was climbing into the vehicle, there was a lot of stuff on the passenger floorboard and seat, and so he was just crawled in sideways, and one of his feet was still outside the passenger door. Officer Aiken and Officer Conrad were giving direction to Sergeant Lewis to try to unbuckle the seat belt so that they could continue to try to get Mr. Kinney out of the vehicle. At that point, after he had been tasered, he started to reach toward the console, and that's when Officer Aiken recognized that he was going to put the vehicle in to drive and drive off. Sergeant Lewis, because it was an electric vehicle, there wasn't any sound, and so when he came upon the vehicle, assumed that it was off. And so with Sergeant Lewis in the vehicle, Mr. Kinney took off with full throttle, striking Sergeant Lewis's patrol SUV, going up on the sidewalk, and then continuing eastbound on Olympic Boulevard. Sergeant Lewis was struggling to get control of the vehicle with Mr. Kinney being a very large person, and Sergeant Lewis not being so large. I think he is about 5'6" and 180 pounds compared to Mr. Kinney's 6'2", 235. And so the struggle for control of the vehicle was not, Sergeant Lewis was making no impact on Mr. Kinney. Sergeant Lewis was yelling for Mr. Kinney to stop the vehicle. Mr. Kinney made no reaction to that. Sergeant Lewis yelled for him to stop, "You're going to kill us both." Mr. Kinney continued on at a high rate of speed, and Sergeant Lewis then fired 3 shots that hit the torso of Mr. Kinney without response. Mr. Kinney flinched at one point, and then Sergeant Lewis, as Mr. Kinney was continuing on driving at a high rate of speed, fired 2 more shots, striking Mr. Kinney in the head and immediately causing his death. At that point, the vehicle crashed into some trees along Olympic Boulevard, and then came back into the roadway, crossed Olympic, and went through a fence, and came to a stop when it struck a delivery truck. The speed of the vehicle as it crossed Olympic and went through the fence is estimated between 20 and 40 miles an hour. Because during the time period of the vehicle driving, I don't know if it was when it went up on the sidewalk or when it struck the trees, but one of the wheels that does the measuring for the speeds and the airbag deployment malfunctioned, and so the final speed is not completely accurate. but because they were able to go back and review the data from the airbags and the tires, they were able to determine that the speed was about 70 miles an hour at the first impact, and then somewhere between 20 and 40 miles an hour at the final impact. Based upon all of the circumstances, I have ruled that it was a lawful use of deadly force. It's a tragic incident. Mr. Kinney suffered from schizophrenia that was diagnosed while he was in college, and his family very supportive of him, and obviously very devastated by this turn of events and the loss of their child and sibling. The days preceding this event included Mr. Kinney having contact with the Lane County Sheriff's Office just a couple of days before. He called the Sheriff's Office 5 times in a day to report the various crimes and then to make inquiry about obtaining a firearm. But nobody from Springfield Police at the time of the contact was aware of who Mr. Kinney was. His family, because in the summer of 2018, he had had some reports of bizarre behavior with Springfield Utility Board employees. His parents actually came in and talked to Springfield Police to try to put an alert, and you can address how that system works and the contacts that they had. But no one was aware until an hour into the investigation even who Mr. Kinney was, and that was when one of the detectives from the IDFIT recognized his vehicle as having been involved in some bizarre behaviors at the Lane County Courthouse. The IDFIT was activated immediately after the incident. It was a response time of, about 15 minutes for activation. Because radio traffic was being monitored by other police agencies, the response was immediate at the time that there was an officer involved in a pursuit and that he was in a vehicle that was being driven by somebody away from the scene. So there was an immediate response from Eugene Police and OSP prior to the IDFIT call out. So there were a lot of resources available to help maintain the scene. When IDFIT arrived, Eugene Police Detective Jeremy Williams was made lead detective for the investigation, and Justin Myers from Springfield Police was the co-lead, so that briefings could be given to the chief regularly and consistently. Again, this has been our third use of force investigation for the IDFIT this year, and so I can't thank our agencies enough for the support that they lend. The amount of resource that is required to conduct these investigations is tremendous, and so that all hands were on deck immediately, and the investigation was very thorough. They managed to get video from all of the businesses that had it available along Olympic Boulevard, because Springfield police vehicles do not have cameras and the officers don't have body-worn cameras. So the obtaining of the video was actually able to be put with the audio from the 911 call, and so there really is a real-time capture of these events. And so it you can imagine how alarming that was for Sergeant Lewis, as he was in a vehicle speeding at 70 miles an hour, not even in a seat with a seat belt on, struggling to gain control of that. It was just a tremendous, emotional, impactful scene and an event that for a very short period of time, this has a lot of incredible detail to it. And the investigation very thoroughly captured all of that. And so I have a lot of confidence in the reports that were done and the timeliness. This was an event from March 31st, and I had the reports on Friday afternoon. And so I really want to express my appreciation to the agencies for that. I met with the family yesterday and let them know what was happening and what my findings were going to be today. And I expect to have a written memo about it. It's in early draft form. I didn't, just in the timeline, I wasn't able to get it completed, but I will have something out in writing, hopefully by the end of the day today or tomorrow. And so, do you have?
I'd just like to make a couple comments and thank the DA Perlow for doing an excellent job of providing details of the events that occurred. I think we'll take questions when you get a chance, but initially I would like to say, the Sergeant R.A. Lewis found himself in a very difficult set of circumstances. And police officers have to make split-second decisions. I say split-second, microseconds on a course of action. And he found himself, as described, going 70 miles an hour towards some trees and inside a very small electric vehicle. And the outcome of that's pretty obvious, I think. If he were to hit those objects head on, that Sergeant Lewis wouldn't have survived that. And so we take any use of force, especially deadly physical force, very seriously. I'm very appreciative of the IDFIT team for coming out and handling that investigation, did an excellent job. And we'll take questions if you want. Yes, Sergeant Lewis suffered a broken right arm in 2 different places, some small contusions on his other arm, and I believe he's got some small contusions on his head. Akins has suffered some injuries to his hand. Originally they thought it was broken, but that has since changed.
Sergeant Lewis in the car and he's going like he's split and he's taken away. He's very lucky to be there.
Absolutely.
Talk about that. I mean, that covers a lot of these situations. The first time I've heard about this.
Well, and it's the first time I've had this situation also in my 35-year career. Officer Lewis found himself in a very precarious situation. Many times we get individuals in the cars and we're trying to extricate them from the vehicle, and it's very difficult when someone locks himself inside with the steering wheel in their hands and their feet. They can pretty much lock themselves in there and trying to get them out. Sergeant Lewis's idea of getting the passenger seat was well-founded on his part. He wanted to do a couple different things. One, make sure the vehicle was disabled. Since it was an electric vehicle, he couldn't find the keys, couldn't find that. And the other thing he was trying to do is unhook the seatbelt if the individual was seatbelted in there. And before that happened, obviously the car took off at a high rate of speed. And as maybe you know, electric vehicles can go from 0 to 70 in a very quick period of time, much faster than your conventional vehicles can.
You mentioned about what items in the back seat of the car in front of you. Was RA in the back or was he in the back?
In the front passenger seat.
So you said there's footage inconsistencies on the music. Is it public?
We'll make it available.
Patty, can you talk about the first issue when the officers approached the car real quick? And I know you went through it, but just basically from the schedule out what happened early on when they approached the vehicle.
So there were actually 3 different stops. At the first stop is when Officer Aiken was concerned enough about the behavior of the driver that he didn't approach the vehicle. He was waiting for somebody to come, and that's when Mr. Kinney threw the siren device out of the vehicle at Officer Aiken and then drove off. Then there was a second stop, and then finally the third stop is where Sergeant Lewis had arrived with his vehicle. Officer Conrad arrived shortly thereafter, and that was where they were trying to get Mr. Kinney physically out of the vehicle.
And is that where Mr. Lewis attempted to extricate the suspect?
Yes. So Sergeant Lewis went to the passenger side, Officer Aiken went to the driver's side of the vehicle, and they both broke the windows with window punch devices. And then Officer Aiken cleared out the glass with his flashlight and was trying to get Mr. Kinney out of the vehicle. And he had not been complying during any of his contacts. And in fact, while he was on the line with 911, the dispatcher was telling him very calmly, you need to listen to what the officers are telling you and to comply with their directions. And it was that was one of his stops, is when he pulled over to have a conversation with the 911 dispatcher, and then just did not follow those directions. So Sergeant Lewis broke out the passenger window with a window punch, and then removed the rest of the glass from the window and reached in. Neither officer was familiar with this make and model of vehicle and how to get the doors unlocked or the latches open. But Sergeant Lewis found the latch and managed to get the passenger door open and climbed into the vehicle to assist with getting Mr. Kinney out the other side.
And that's when Mr. Kinney decided to drive and left the scene. So the officer was physically in the vehicle. Mr. Kinney was driving. Describe that for me.
So there were actually officers with hands-on at both sides of Mr. Kinney at that point, and that was the time where the two officers, Officer Conrad and Officer Aiken, used their tasers without any effect. And it was immediately after Mr. Kinney was tasered that he reached toward the console and put the car in drive and took off. He struck Sergeant Lewis's patrol SUV, and it bounced back, a good 10 feet. And then Mr. Kinney drove up on the sidewalk and around the vehicle, and then back onto Olympic.
How far did he go from Olympic down to where the final resting stop for the officer?
So that was, what, 35th?
36, and then the final place was 3900 block. So
So about
3 or 4 blocks.
3 or 4 blocks from the time the officer was in the car and trying to stop it.
correct.
And then explain one more time on the final stop where Officer Lewis was attempting to stop the vehicle and be fired.
So after Mr. Kinney put the car in drive and took off with Sergeant Lewis in the vehicle, they were struggling. Sergeant Lewis was trying to gain control of the vehicle, get control of the steering wheel, and was not successful in doing that. And that was when he made the decision to fire his weapon.
How many times did he fire the weapon?
There were 6 shots. 5 of them hit Mr. Kinney.
That stopped Mr. Kinney from driving, and that's when it crashed.
So the first 3 shots were body shots to Mr. Kinney's torso that did not have any effect on him. He flinched, was the comment that Sergeant Lewis noticed. So there were 4 shots, and then a pause, and then 2 more shots. That's when Mr. Kinney died, and the vehicle went into the tree.
And then Mr. Lewis got out of the vehicle, or was Mr.
No.
Lewis?
Sergeant Lewis was still in the vehicle when it struck the trees, went back onto Olympic Boulevard, across Olympic, and through a fence into a delivery truck. And then Sergeant Lewis was able to get out of the vehicle.
After he shot Mr. Kinney, he was able to grab the wheel and turn it, and that's why it ended up going southbound across Olympic Street and crashed into the fenced area.
And a justification for his using his weapon, you found that it's justified.
It's a lawful use of force under the circumstances of protecting his own life. He was justified in using deadly force at that point.
Stopping the incident.
Correct.
You've been here a long time. I've never been through one of these. Have you seen anything like this at all?
I have been here for a very long time, and no, I have not seen anything like this. There are people who fail to comply with directions from law enforcement, and sometimes during the course of those events, they change their mind and actually listen to what the directions are, and everything ends peacefully. And then there are the circumstances where the person just, in this circumstance, Mr. Kinney suffers from paranoia and a mental illness that affected his ability to perceive the circumstances.
I know I've asked the chief this question, but Mr. Sergeant Lewis, Chief Lewis's officer, is lucky to be alive. What do you think?
He's very lucky to be alive, and while the broken arm is a significant injury, it definitely could have been a lot worse than that.
Not to mention the public.
Right. Olympic Boulevard had plenty of traffic at 9 o'clock at night. And so in fact, there was another truck that was approaching westbound on Olympic that the vehicle nearly hit prior to going through the fence.
One more question. The infant team, they did all of this in 2 or 3 weeks, and that's how they come back.
Yes, everyone on the IDFIT is tasked with putting everything else aside. Their agencies lose those detectives for the time it takes to conduct this investigation. Oh, IDFIT is the Interagency Deadly Force Investigative Team. It's comprised of the local agencies here, so that when there's a use of deadly force incident, the agency isn't investigating their own use of force. It's run by Sergeant Ryan Martin of the Oregon State Police and Sergeant Ryan Lane of the Lane County Sheriff's Office. In this particular circumstance, Sergeant Martin was out of state on a homicide investigation, and so Sergeant Lane was the chair of IDFIT for this investigation.
How many years has Sergeant Lewis been on your department?
Well, he has 26 years of law enforcement experience. Prior to coming to us, he was a officer for Florence Police Department, but he's been with us for over 20 years.
And prior to being on patrol that night, did he have any other positions in your department?
Sergeant Lewis has had a number of positions. He worked investigations as a narcotics detective. He has been on the SWAT team. He is our crisis intervention training coordinator right now. And I'm sure there's a number of other positions I'll think of here in just a second that Sergeant Lewis has held since he's been here.
Have you spoken to him since this incident occurred?
Yes, I have.
Can you describe a little bit of his emotions and what he went through and what he told you about that incident that night?
Well, I think Sergeant Lewis, one is he feels very fortunate, and we feel very fortunate that he's alive right now. He really, truly believed that he was going to die in that crash. Imagine going 70 miles an hour towards trees inside that small vehicle, unseatbelted in the car, and you can imagine the impact that would have. And I think that's probably the best way to describe it is he just feels very fortunate. Obviously, he does not want to, or as no police officer wants to use deadly force, but under the circumstances, and again in those microseconds, he had to make that decision to do that. And Sergeant Lewis is an experienced officer, and again, we're just very thankful that he wasn't injured more than he was.
How many minutes did this activity last?
About 4.
And did anyone else prior to that?
No, all of the vehicles, all of the weapons of all responding officers were checked, and all rounds were accounted for.
Anything else?
I'm sure that I will think of something, but I'll have a written account of this event soon, and hopefully it will address all of the things that I have forgotten to tell you now.
Thank you.